The last 12 months have been a strange time in football, just as they have been outside of the world of sport. We have seen empty stadiums, postponed or cancelled competitions, and Chris Wood scored a Premier League hat-trick. Each event seemingly less likely and even less plausible than the last. There has been another change that has occurred, at least in terms of English football, when it comes to players putting their head above the parapet and letting their views be known on any given subject or issue. Just last week, we saw Hamza Chowdhury collect his FA Cup winners' medal with a Palestinian flag draped over him before he and Wesley Fofana proudly displayed the flag around the ground and for a photo op during the celebrations. Just a few days later, Paul Pogba and Amad Diallo followed suit in the aftermath of Manchester United's draw with Fulham during the club's last home game of the season. This comes in light of a season, or couple of seasons, in which we have also seen both plenty of support and plenty of backlash for stances such as players taking the knee, support for Black Lives Matter, and Marcus Rashford's campaigning around free school meals, child hunger, and homelessness. This increase in outspokenness, gestural support for causes, and activism has led to a couple of phrases becoming synonymous with the sport, particularly on social media. Namely, keep politics out of football. Football, in that instance, can sometimes be substituted for sport or the game, and stick to football, the latter of which has become the stock response made by people on Twitter, responding to any post by a footballer which doesn't directly relate to football. It doesn't even have to be about politics, that second one. Gary Lineker could tweet that he thinks Baby Bells are overrated, or that Get Weird was Little Mix's magnum opus, and he would be flooded with responses telling him to keep his nose out. In fact, I went and counted, and in the last 3 days alone, at the time of this recording, more than 50 people have tweeted Gary Lineker, telling him directly to stick to football. And in regards to the first argument that you see made, of keeping politics out of football, I think that opens up rather a large can of worms with regards to what is and isn't political. Is Marcus Rashford's campaigning political? He has certainly gone on record as saying he doesn't think so, but some people would disagree. Is taking a knee political? Is the poppy political? What about the kick it out campaign? Or hanging a massive Vote Liberal Democrat poster from the top of Villa Park, mowing Vote Ed Davey onto the pitch, and forcing the entire Villa squad to tattoo Stop Brexit onto their foreheads as part of all future club contracts? Alright, I'm pretty sure the last one is political, as well as a pretty clear human rights violation, and he'd be alright anyway, since he could just get an Irish passport, but the rest are all a little bit more opaque. As you can see here, there are a number of different definitions of the word politics. The first few, I would suggest, don't really cover any of the supposedly political activities that we have seen in football, or at least English football, over the last 12 months. And by the fourth one, which probably does cover it, you could argue that covers pretty much everything. Let me put this another way. If you want to take a really consistent stance on this issue, you either have a very clearly defined understanding of what is considered political, and that would likely be any unambiguous party political allegiances, or you have a total blanket ban on footballers exercising expression on virtually anything outside of football. And even some issues inside of it would be shaky ground. Again, that seems like a potential human rights violation and doesn't strike me as being particularly feasible unless the FA, EFL and the Premier League were to go full Kim Jong-un and just start slapping out enormous bans and fines for doing anything other than turning up to training and to games. Oh, volunteering at a food bank are we, Mr. Iwobi? I suppose you'll be blaming Tory cuts and austerity for people going hungry then. Here's a 6-month ban and we're repossessing your house. We saw you singing along to the national anthem before that Estonia game, Harry. Your anti-democratic royalist propagandising British exceptionalism isn't appreciated, and for that we'll be stripping you of every trophy that you have ever won. What? Oh, alright, clever dick. All your caps then. And you're banned from ever leaving Tottenham. I don't know what you're laughing at, Jesse. We just got footage of you not singing along to the national anthem from 2016. I suppose you're an abolitionist, are you? Yeah, alright, you didn't know the words. I wasn't born yesterday. I hereby ban you from dancing to Michael Jackson in the dressing room, and we've told Companies House to shut down J Lings Limited immediately. Where was I? Oh yeah. I think that's going to be pretty tricky to enforce, which means we're left with a decision surrounding what is and isn't permitted. And When doing so, we ought not forget that we all have our own political biases that will likely cloud our judgment on what we deem to be legitimate or acceptable and not. The vast majority of the time, when I see people or even publications telling people to keep politics out of football or to stick to football, it is those of a slightly more socially conservative or right-wing persuasion. Now, that could just be because I follow a load of far-right bigots on social media, or because I follow a load of woke, snowflake, social justice warrior footballers who draw the ire of those who disagree with them. Or just maybe it's because that side of the political divide are more likely to want a definitive separation between sport and politics. I don't know. The perception of footballers certainly seems to be that they lean left on social issues, or at least that they are somewhat progressive. Whether that be because they are relatively young, diverse, and tend to come from working class backgrounds. Of course, there is no research or data out there that can prove any kind of widespread political leanings among footballers in any direction, which means that all we really have to go on is anecdotal evidence and tangible examples of players making their feelings known. Increasingly, within English football, players have been incredibly reluctant to express any political beliefs whatsoever. And understandably so. Politics in the UK has become so polarised over the last decade, and particularly in the post-Brexit landscape, that if you want an easy life, it is far easier to just keep your head down and leave your political persuasions in the strict confidentiality of the ballot box. This reluctance was very clearly emphasised during the 2016 referendum on the United Kingdom's membership of the European Union, when David Cameron sought out the help of a footballer, or footballers, to back the Remain campaign. Aware of strong support for Leave in the North East, Cameron's team sought out the support of then Newcastle and Sunderland stars Andros Townsend and Fabio Borini. Borini, who is obviously from mainland Europe, was willing to pose for some kind of photo op, but Townsend refused, foiling the plans, and footballers largely refrained from getting involved in the heated referendum debates. Some of you may recall Michael Jordan's "Republicans buy sneakers too" quote from the 1990 United States Senate elections in North Carolina, after he had been asked to back the Democratic nominee Harvey Gantt. It's a similar story here. Like the US, the UK is a nation divided, with impassioned views on both sides that have only intensified in recent years. But when footballers do feel either confident enough or principled enough to air their views, which comments spark the most outrage? When I say stick to football, those of you who are based in the UK or are on Twitter will almost certainly have thought of either Gary Lineker, Gary Neville, or possibly Jamie Carragher, all of whom have been pretty outspoken critics of the current Conservative government in Great Britain and Northern Ireland. But why is this the case? Is it that footballers just tend to be critical of the Conservative Party or of incumbent politicians? Well, that's the thing. Not really, no. In terms of players and recently retired players who have offered unequivocal support for a political party, well, firstly, there aren't very many of them, and secondly, it is pretty evenly split, at least among high-profile players. Sol Campbell, Jonathan Walters, Carl Henry and Frank Lampard have all voiced strong support for the Conservative Party in the past. Oh, and Lyle Taylor, if he counts as being high profile. All of those players received some degree of backlash online from people who disagreed with their honestly held political beliefs, particularly Jonathan Walters since he was born on Merseyside, but none of that criticism ever really left the social media bubble. Even more controversially, you might think though, was the case of Fleetwood Town chairman and owner Andy Pilley, who used Fleetwood Town's official club social media channels and club website to encourage supporters to vote Conservative in the 2019 general election, claiming that if Labour were to win, Fleetwood would lose their Football League status. That wasn't actually part of the Labour Party manifesto to relegate Fleetwood back down into the non-league game, but Pilley told supporters that Labour's plans to renationalise the energy sector would lead to a loss of income for him and therefore for the club, and that they would therefore drop like a stone. Now, I am very happy to be corrected if I am wrong on this, but I do not recall the official social media accounts or website of any other English Football League club ever being used explicitly to tell or encourage supporters to vote for any other political party, let alone basically throwing in a threat if they didn't. The owner of my club, Hull City, didn't go quite that far, but has also been pretty outspoken in his political beliefs. A former donor to the Labour Party, Assem Alam, claimed that he donated to Labour in order to reduce their reliance on trade union donations, saying that the unions held too much influence within the party. His support switched once he felt Ed Miliband had taken the party too far to the left, at which point Alam became a major Conservative donor, in addition to donating £100,000 to Owen Smith's Labour leadership challenge, and even offering to fund a breakaway centrist party made up of Labour MPs who opposed Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the party. It would seem Mr. Alam disliked Jeremy Corbyn almost as much as Hull City fans dislike him. So it is worth noting that football is not necessarily particularly politically aligned, at least from the data at our disposal. Just what is different is the reaction to different political views being had. Carl Henry, much like Gary Lineker, still gets people who disagree with him telling him to stick to football. And to his credit, when Darren Grimes recently appeared on talk radio saying footballers should get back to kicking the ball around, Henry voiced his disagreement, despite being of a similar political persuasion to Grimes. The difference, however, is that kickback is limited to the confines of social media. The Daily Mail writes several articles about Gary Lineker almost every week. They have written hundreds in total. Almost all of them are disparaging. But when Carl Henry tweeted, "Footballers aside, why do people demonise our country's high earners, yet have no issue with those who abuse the benefits system?" and "Too many feel that they're entitled to other people's wealth. You're not. Be smart, work hard, make your own money, #vote conservative," along with a string of other political tweets that he has made in the many years since, there was no backlash in the print media. At least, not as far as I can tell. The regional Express and Star newspaper reported on Stan Collymore's response to Henry, but it didn't take a side. Meanwhile, The Independent, which is among the UK's few non-conservative, or at least not explicitly conservative supporting newspapers, actually published an article in support of Henry, sharing his political views, and encouraged other players to do likewise. Again, please do correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but I have never seen an opinion piece in the Daily Mail or the Telegraph saying, "You might not agree with Gary Lineker, but let's hear him out on, the refugee crisis," or whatever else it might be. After the Palestinian flag was brought out following Leicester City's FA Cup final win, there were unsurprisingly some rather extreme takes on social media, and the keep politics out of football debate reached something of a peak. But some of the discourse is just so outrageously disingenuous as to be laughable. Clearly, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is one which is particularly divisive. But take this tweet from Gabriel Milland, who wrote, "Presumably those defending Chowdhury and Fofana wouldn't mind if Chelsea's Jewish owner, a resident of Israel, sends the team out wearing IDF uniforms when they play next week. Football belongs to everyone, not one side in a war." That isn't actually how you spell Chowdhury in Hamza Chowdhury's name, though it is how you spell Chowdhury in Anjem Chowdhury's name, the infamous British Islamist who was convicted of inviting support for ISIS in 2016, though I'm happy to chalk that down as an honest, innocent mistake. But surely the like-for-like of Hamza Chowdhury and Wesley Fofana displaying a Palestine flag at full time would be for two footballers to display an Israeli flag at full time, and not for teams to take the pitch wearing Israeli Defence Force uniforms. As I said at the beginning of this video, it seems clear to me that a line has to be drawn somewhere. Surely, it is not unthinkable that the line is somewhere between carrying a flag onto a pitch and wearing the military uniforms of a nation state during a game. If you say you cannot display the Palestinian flag, surely it follows that you cannot display the Israeli flag either. And then, why should you be able to show a French flag, or the St. George flag, or the Union flag? There was another tweet in the aftermath of that FA Cup final, which I think goes to the heart of this issue more so than anything else though, and that's this one. Nick Timothy, the Telegraph columnist, former Conservative Party advisor, and failed Conservative candidate for MP in the West Midlands, tweeted that football has got itself into such a mess. Time to go back to the old-fashioned rule of keeping politics out of the game. Now, Timothy didn't state when this old-fashioned rule was actually in place, and as someone who is fairly passionate about the history of the game in this country, and beyond, I have to say that I am unaware of any such rule ever being in place. Perhaps he is using the word rule figuratively, and is simply saying that football used to be free of politics in the good old days, now it isn't, and I preferred it before. I think this is a fairly common view. The only flaw to it is that it is totally ahistoric. English football, and football in just about every corner of the globe, has never been free from politics. That is the England team joining their German counterparts in performing a Nazi salute, by the way, just before the two teams played in January 1938. The England players didn't actually want to do that, but under pressure from politicians and diplomats, they eventually agreed. Hasn't aged well, has it? But let's go back to the good old days, Timothy? Sport has been intertwined with politics virtually since the dawn of man, or at least since the dawn of the ancient Olympics over 2,700 years ago. Politicians have forever used sport as a tool of state propaganda, to further agendas, build and develop international relations, to broker trade deals, to distract, divert attention from other issues, and to try and cool tensions. Supporters have, throughout history, used sport as an avenue for protest, and as a meeting ground, and athletes have used their sporting platforms to air political grievances for as long as time. Sports stadiums have been the site of state executions, terror attacks, refugee camps, and sieges. Games of football have started wars and ended them. In a nation where Prince William is the president of our Football Association, having replaced Prince Andrew in 2006, where the Chinese president Xi Jinping's state visit to the United Kingdom involves a trip to the Etihad with David Cameron, and Arab states literally own clubs within our footballing pyramid, it is a bit rich to start telling Shay Adams to keep politics out of football for saying that NHS nurses should get a pay rise. That is a fictional example for the record. Shay Adams could hate nurses for all that I know. I mean, I doubt it, but you never know. You may wish that sport and politics weren't intertwined, but they undeniably, and I think irreversibly are, especially when your definition of politics comes to include virtually every societal and economic issue that exists. In the 1970s, Brian Clough and Jack Charlton joined forces against the National Front. Were they bringing politics into football? The likes of Bill Shankly, Brian Clough, Matt Busby, and Alex Ferguson, four of the finest British managers of all time, spanning numerous generations, all spoke of their socialist beliefs at length. Were they bringing politics into football? The only time which politics hasn't really been a common theme within English football has been over the last decade or so. And even then, it has still been there, just tucked away a bit and not spoken about so much. That was the anomaly. Not now. If anything, this is a return to normality, and it was only really in England that football stopped being an active voice within these wider issues. Personally, and regrettably so because I don't really like to sit on the fence, I can see both sides of this debate. On the one hand, there is so much polarisation in politics these days that seems to be impossible to block out. I can see how the idea of 90 minutes of escapism, in which you can forget about all of your personal and political grievances and just watch your team get massacred 6-1 following a 5-hour drive to Bournemouth, I did that by the way, that's me, I can see how that can appeal to people. On the flip side, football gives a platform to a section of society that we so rarely hear from within wider political and societal discourse, as young, working class, and often non-white men and women, who, unsurprisingly, sometimes have issues they feel passionately about and want to exercise the voice and platform that they have been given. As a thought exercise, try and think of a young black man in Britain right now with a profile or platform that is as large as Marcus Rashford's or Raheem Sterling's. I had a quick think myself, but who can you think of, since most of you probably have a far better grasp than me when it comes to popular culture. I can think of Stormzy, Lewis Hamilton, who is mixed race, is also an athlete and has also come in for plenty of criticism, KSI I suppose, at least in terms of his online presence, and then possibly Anthony Joshua, who is again a sports person, but has been less outspoken on vaguely political issues, at least as far as I'm aware. So, I understand both sides, but the reality is that one side is asking for something which isn't possible and that has never been the case. Without understanding changes in Britain's political landscape over the last century, whether that be the post-war consensus, Thatcherism or Blairism, you cannot understand the way in which football has changed during those same periods. The European Super League did not happen in a vacuum. The Premier League was not created in a vacuum. The average age of match-going fans doubling in the space of less than 30 years certainly did not happen in a vacuum. Just take the recent police crime sentencing and courts bill proposed by the UK government. Whether you think it is brilliant, terrible, or you've never even heard of it, the far-reaching powers that it grants to the police would give them the power to break up any fan protests at football matches and to arrest people even if they are engaging in entirely peaceful protests. Whether you think that is a good thing or a bad thing, given that we saw the importance of protesting in opposition to the European Super League, how can you possibly detangle that bill from the world of football? It has a direct impact upon it. The same goes for requests for the government to introduce a body to bring in regulations of English football. That would require an incumbent government to bring that in and to decide what those regulations should be. That can't possibly be entirely detached from football, given that it would specifically and solely relate to the world of football. As is so often the case in the UK, I think there is a section of society that yearns to go back to a time that never actually existed. Sport has always been political. Football has always been political. You may not like it, you may have only just realised, and you may find yourself agreeing or disagreeing with the causes players support more or less than you previously did. But none of this is new, and it isn't going away. That's it for today's video, but thank you all very much as ever for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed today's video. Just leave it if you didn't. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and make sure that you subscribe and turn on notifications, of course, for HITC Sevens. You can also find me on social media, on either Twitter or Instagram by the username @HITC Sevens on both, should you wish to do so.